All right. So again, we have hate this thing. So today, kind of have a lot, but can you all see that okay? Okay. Minimize this. So today we actually cover two parts of the book, parts 5 and 6. And I think logically kind of makes sense, right? Because part 3, I believe, or sorry, let me go back to the table of contents. Part 3, yeah. I'm having trouble counting today. Part 3 was called the production of absolute surplus value. Part 4 is the production of relative surplus value. So kind of logically speaking, it makes sense. Part 5, the production of absolute and relative surplus value. Now, I find I still don't really understand, but Marx starts off chapter 16 with a kind of tangent, I would consider, which he starts to say, you know, in the chapter on the labor process, which, by the way, I should have just put the image here on page 640, whatever the first page, 643, on that first page of chapter 16. He says, you know, when we just first looked at the labor process, it was like a process between humans and nature. And it says, see chapter 5. By the way, that's wrong. It's chapter 7. It's like amazing to me that there's like just these errors in this book and that they persist even in different printings. But anyway, and then he mentions that he also had this footnote about this concept of productive labor and what productive labor is. And so he says, we must now develop this point further. And I'm still not clear why. It's not clear to me why this fits in this chapter, which is called absolute and relative surplus value. But nevertheless, it's a big issue in Marxist theory, which is what is this distinction between productive labor and unproductive labor? And he kind of fleshes it out right here. So it's kind of crucial conceptually. And just before I get to it, I think one thing we want to think about is that Marx does not think of these categories in normative ethical terms. Like we often want to sort of attach more goodness to the idea of productive labor as being, you know, productive and being contributing and all these kind of normative ideals we have. But I think he lays it out quite clearly, despite those normative ideals we might attach. He says capitalist production is not merely the production of commodities, but by its very essence, the production of surplus value. The worker produces not for himself, but for capital. It is no longer sufficient, therefore, for them simply to produce. They must produce surplus value. The only worker who is productive is one who produces surplus value for the capitalist, or in other words, contributes towards self-valorization of capital. So again, that's sort of the definition of a productive laborer and productive labor under capitalism, right? Now, in the first page, he kind of talks about productive labor in sort of general terms, but under capitalism, it's the workers that directly produce surplus value. Now, so before I get into like what that means, you know, you could think about like in a factory, you might have workers that are directly with their labor sort of making shoes, right? But you might have another worker up in the office that's just sort of bookkeeping the you know, like how many shoes are produced and the receipts for the, and so it's clear that that worker's doing kind of a necessary cost of the operation, but it's not clear they're actively with their labor producing surplus value, producing that extra value. So he says, if we may take an example outside the sphere of material production, a schoolmaster is a productive worker when, in addition to belaboring the heads of pupils, they work themselves into the ground to enrich the owner of the school. That the latter has laid out their capital in a teaching factory instead of a sausage factory, which I think it's funny we often talk about like, this is how you make the sausage, and like sauce, like that idea of a sausage factory, I guess, still existed in Marx's time, makes no difference to the relation. The concept of a productive worker therefore implies not merely a relation between the activity of work and its useful effect between the worker and the product of their work, but also specifically social relation of production, a relation with a historical origin, which stamps the worker as capital's direct means of valorization. To be a productive worker is therefore not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. So a lot here. First of all, a lot of Marxists and a lot of socialists, a lot of people with this kind of politics often think Marx means by productive worker someone that works in factories, someone that does material work with their hands and kind of adds value with. I think he's sort of purposefully saying that's not the case here. He's trying to use this example of a school to try to show that, like, even if we're not in material production proper, you could be a productive worker if you're producing surplus value for the capitalist, right? And just to kind of get us to think a little more about this, and I don't think Marx could have predicted this. Well, actually, he probably could have, because he talked last week about these factories that had little schools inside them, right? I bet the teachers in those factories are productive workers because they're producing education and surplus value for those factories. But we have something called capitalist schooling in our society. They're called for-profit universities, right? These things do exist. A lot of people claim, I would agree, that our university, Syracuse, is a for-profit university, but technically, legally speaking, it's a nonprofit entity. And by the way, that allows it to get all these benefits because it supposedly has this kind of like public mission that nonprofits have. And therefore, it's able to be tax exempt. It's one of the largest property owners in the city of Syracuse, but it doesn't pay any taxes because it's a nonprofit entity. But that's different than the University of Phoenix. The University of Phoenix is a for-profit university. They market all over the television to get people to go. Their degrees are of dubious merit. They've been known to do predatory student loan type stuff to kind of get their students. They name stadiums like football stadiums after them. So this is a different kind of level of a capitalist school. But what Marx is saying is that even though this school is not producing sausage, it's not producing shoes or some material thing, it's still exploiting workers in the effort to produce surplus value, right? And so the workers, the teachers employed by the University of Phoenix are workers, and the capital who owns this University of Phoenix are capital owners, and they're exploiting those workers to create surplus value. So therefore, we really want to think broadly about what production means in this analysis, because it's not just material production. It's anyone that's producing any kind of commodity that's offered for sale that is generating surplus value for a capitalist. The other thing important about this is this line about it's not a piece of luck, it's a misfortune. So again, all these normative ideas we might attach to, oh, I'm a productive worker, right? And people, for instance, some of you have written papers already about this distinction between household work and work in the factory, right? And social reproductive work and work in the hidden abode of production. And there have been these debates in Marxism where a lot of feminists rightly want to say this work that happens in the household, this social reproduction work, is valuable, is worth, there's a whole movement that's called like wages for housework. And sometimes, though, that debate will say like that work should be considered productive labor, and it's not unproductive, right? This work is so important in the household, right? But sometimes those debates they're sort of attaching these normative political ideas to this distinction between productive and unproductive. And Marx is just saying, no, if you're productive, it just means you're exploited by capital directly in the production of surplus value. And that's not a happy, normative, good thing. That's a misfortune, right? That means you're subjugated to capital, right? So for all I think we talked last week, all the kind of subjugation of the household under capitalism, households are different than capitalist businesses, right? They're not run for profit. They're not selling commodities to accumulate capital and this kind of thing. So the other thing that kind of gets, when we start to think who produces surplus value, you can have some broader definitions. And when you get into volume 2 of Capital, Marx just throws in that actually the transportation of commodities is included in the production of those commodities, because it's like this necessary labor to kind of move the commodity from where it's produced to where it's sold. And so you have workers like truck drivers. They are productive workers. They are producing surplus value for the capitalists who are selling whatever are in those trucks. You have the warehouse workers that I know have become really politicized in the kind of increasing age of Amazon and shipping of commodities and so forth. But also like a site that under capitalism we would typically think of as a site of consumption, like a McDonald's, or a site of food consumption or retail. You know, you are selling the commodity there, but in the back there are still workers who are putting the finishing labor, putting the finished production onto those commodities, and they are therefore producing surplus value in the site of consumption, in the retail site, if you will. And that would include workers. You know, you could even include the workers stocking the shelves, and all this kind of movement of the commodities to the final destination are part of the labor and the production that generates that surplus value for the capitalist. Okay, so again, I find this is kind of a tangent, and then Marx goes on to talk more about this distinction between absolute and relative surplus value. And he introduces this distinction that basically says the production of absolute surplus value turns exclusively on the length of the working day, whereas the production of relative surplus value completely revolutionizes the technical process of labor and the groupings into which society is divided. It therefore requires a specifically capitalist mode of production, a mode of production which, along with its methods, means, and conditions, arises and develops on the basis of formal subsumption of labor under capital. This formal subsumption is then replaced by real subsumption. By the way, if you all are interested, he elaborates on these concepts in the appendix to this book, which was sort of like a lost chapter of Capital. There's debate on where he wanted to insert this chapter. It's very long. I've often read it in this class, but I decided to not read it because it doesn't quite fit. But if you're interested, please read it. It's fascinating. But in any event, if you recall, he kind of lays out this theory where formal subsumption is kind of where you find the labor process as it was in medieval times, like, you know, artisans and domestic workers and handicrafts and all this kind of old traditional way of working. You just take that way of working and you subsume it under wage labor. Right now you have capitalists that are employing those workers. And because the labor process is kind of static and sort of old-fashioned, if you will, the only way to generate surplus value under that formal subsumption is to basically extend the working day, right? Because you haven't changed the mode of labor. You just have the kind of sort of old school, the OG form of working, and you just can just get that. So if you're a capitalist, you just want to get them to work longer under that kind of static old school way of working. But what we learned is that relative surplus value is about revolutionizing the labor process, you know, technological transformation, totally mixing up the division of labor and making things more efficient and dividing, subdividing, and so forth. So essentially that process, which as we learned last week, kind of culminates in the introduction of machinery and the ultimate victory of capital over the labor process, because they finally take control of it. That's what he calls the real subsumption of labor. And again, he kind of equates this real subsumption with what he calls the specifically capitalist mode of production, which he says there, because he's kind of saying when capital confronts workers with these old school methods, it can't really get on its own 2 feet. It can't really you know, start to accumulate and start to generate surplus value at the scale that capitalism is known for. So it's only when you get this real subsumption where capital takes full control, can revolutionize production and generate this sort of new level of productivity that can generate so much surplus value for the capitalist. But again, this distinction between formal and real basically hinges on the distinction between absolute and relative surplus value. So this fits well in this chapter, in this part 5. It's just the productive labor part I don't quite understand. And he does this kind of like sort of trying to think at, one standpoint, the distinction between absolute and relative surplus value appears to be illusory. He mentions that we talked about under the machinery chapter, like it turns out they're doing absolute all the time because they realize they want their machines running 24/7 and all this kind of stuff. But he insists that further down, once the capitalist mode of production has become the established and universal mode of production, I think he's hinting at real subsumption here, the difference between absolute and relative surplus value makes itself felt whenever there is a question of raising the rate of surplus value. Assuming that labor power is paid for at its value, we're confronted with this alternative. On the one hand, if the productivity of labor and its normal degree of intensity is given, the rate of surplus value can be raised only by prolonging the working day. So if you have a kind of fixed level of productivity and you confront, this sort of labor process that can't be changed, your only option, lengthen the working day. On the other hand, if the length of the working day is given, the rate of surplus value can be raised only by a change in the relative magnitudes of the components of the working day, necessary labor and surplus labor. And if wages are not to fall below the value of labor power, this change presupposes a change in either the productivity or intensity of labor. So he does this is kind of review, right? This is kind of like, when your only option is, when value of labor power is fixed, that portion of the day is fixed, your only option is to extend the working day. When the working day is fixed, your only option is to improve productivity. So again, looking at these together. Then he kind of goes into, again, sort of a larger discussion of how the productivity of labor sort of influences society and history and more generally. And to me, this is kind of really rich and historical kind of discussion that I guess is tangentially related to the question of relative surplus value, which ultimately hinges on the productivity of labor, right? So he says, if the worker needs to use all their time to produce the necessary means of subsistence for themselves and their family, they have no time left which to perform unpaid labor for people. So a sort of crucial point that if the amount of labor it takes just to reproduce the workers is so high, you can't have a surplus value. You can't have surplus labor. Unless labor has attained a certain level of productivity, the worker will have no such free time at their disposal. And without superfluous time, there can be no surplus labor, hence no capitalists, and also no slave owners, no feudal barons. In a word, no class of large-scale landed proprietors. So again, all societies have a mode of extracting a surplus from the immediate workers or producers or laborers. And that can be through slavery or through feudal extraction of surplus from serfs and peasants. And under capitalism, it's capitalists who exploit the surplus from wage laborers. But all kind of class societies require on this kind of relationship between the surplus appropriators and the surplus producers, right? So it could be, again, slaves, kings, lords, landlords who extract the surplus, or capitalists, right? But if the amount of labor it takes to reproduce the workers is, if there's not a surplus there, you can have no class of people above them who get to live off their surplus labor, right? It's just, again, quite trans-historical kind of point he's making here. And then he gets into sort of, the capital relation kind of comes out of a history of improving labor productivity. So out of an economic soil that is the product of a long process of development, the existing productivity of labor from which it proceeds at its basis is a gift, not of nature, but of history embracing thousands of centuries. Again, even if we leave aside the question of the development attained by social production, the productivity of labor remains fettered by natural conditions. So those are kind of two kind of points. One, that whatever capital is able to appropriate in terms of productivity above what is necessary to reproduce the labor, like that productivity has been developed over history, over thousands of years. And again, remember last week he talked about the science behind industrial production is sort of appropriated by capital for free, that this understanding of the steam engine and the thermodynamics and all that kind of knowledge is sort of passed down, and capital gets to put it to work in the purpose of producing surplus value and surplus labor. But ultimately, as he gets into here, the productivity of labor is fettered, as he says, by natural conditions. Like he talks about, if you have bad soil, it doesn't matter how much labor you put into it, you're going to get less stuff out of that bad soil than compared to good soil, right? And so a lot of the productivity of labor is sort of contingent on history and nature, right? And natural conditions. And then he gets into quite an interesting discussion of how nature and the environment, for us geographers, like really interesting stuff, like kind of limits what people can, how people can produce in the actual productivity of labor. And he gets into what, if any, usually have a lot more geography students, but if any geography students have taken the history of geographic thought, I guess Natalie, you're doing that, you're in it. So you've probably heard of something called environmental determinism. Well, that's seen as a sort of bad thing that geographers did, and it's really sort of lends itself to a lot of racist sort of ideologies. Well, Marx basically does that right here. He says that talking about where nature is too prodigal with her gifts, she keeps him in hand like a child in lead strings. So he's talking about tropical areas that kind of produce tons of stuff easily from the soil and easily from the trees. That actually makes people like not wanting to develop the productivity of labor because they just have everything easily. So he says humans' own development is not in that case a nature imposed necessity. The mother country, this is in straight environmental determinism. The mother country of capital is not the tropical region with its luxuriant vegetation, but the temperate zone. Where's the temperate zone? Europe, right? So this was a theory that Europeans told themselves, that like, because we have to struggle to produce during the seasons and create a surplus and store it over the winter, we develop civilization because of this climate we're in, because of this growing season, because of the struggle to produce subsistence in our area makes us hardier and more productive and more, and the people in the tropics are just, can just take the stuff, coconuts off the trees and whatever. And so this kind of became an ideological and quite racist ideology that basically said, well, Europeans are superior because they have this certain environment, certain climate. And unfortunately, Marx is a 19th century thinker, and he just kind of takes that quite that ideological stuff and uses it. That said, a geographer would also say that, geography does matter, and the climate that where production happens has an influence, right? And we can't deny that influence. So it's not like Marx is wrong to point out this stuff, but the ways in which this type of thinking gets deployed in imperial kind of colonial justifications of domination is what is a big problem. So it is not the absolute fertility of the soil, but its degree of differentiation, the variety of its natural products, which forms the natural basis for the social division of labor, and which by changes the natural surroundings, spurs humans on to the multiplication of needs, capacities, and the instruments. So again, because of the certain climate or environment, Europeans kind of developed this much more productive division of labor and so forth. Anyway, that's kind of what he covers there. Then in chapter 17, we get more math, everybody's friend Marx and math, and kind of looking at, again, there's these three kind of different things that can affect the surplus value, which is the length of the working day, the intensity of labor, and the productivity of labor. And he kind of wants to look at, what if we hold some of these constant, some of these variable, and how does it affect surplus value? And let's go through all these different 4 scenarios. The first one, the length of the working day and the intensity of labor constant, the productivity of labor variable, again, gets him to talk more about what society can do to increase the productivity of labor. I will say that this number 2 had really kind of given me fits in trying to understand something, because I had often sort of equated improving the productivity of labor with machinery, but also you can, introduce division of labor to make labor more productive, as they're more efficient and subdivided cooperation. But also I've sort of included intensity, increasing speed up of intensity, as something that also just improves how much labor, how much you produced per hour. So it improves your labor productivity. And here Marx kind of says, like, we want to actually keep these things separate. And it's always confused me, and I'm still trying to kind of like figure it out. But he says, increased intensity of labor means increased expenditure of labor in a given time. Hence, a working day of more intense labor is embodied in more products than is one of less intense labor, the length of each working day being the same. Then he kind of says, admittedly, an increase in the productivity of labor will also supply more products in a given working day. But in that case, the value of each single product falls, for it costs less labor than before, whereas in the case mentioned here, that value remains unchanged because each article costs the same amount of labor as before. Here we have an increase in the number of products accompanied by a fall in their individual prices, and their number increases, so does the sum of their prices, whereas in the case of the increase in the productivity, a given value is spread over the greater mass of products. So I've, again, struggled to sort of understand.
I'm lost.
Yeah, so what I've tried to do here is to look at it this way. What if we have a 12-hour day? Just take a 12-hour day, and you have the normal intensity of 10 workers working at their normal level of intensity. Let's say that produces 10 products. What if we then said, okay, 10 workers, we want you to work harder. Let's speed you up. You might heighten the intensity of those 10 workers and get 15 products. But you still had 10 workers working 12 hours, right? But if we were to improve labor productivity of this process, we might produce the same 15 products in 12 hours, but we do it with 2 workers instead, right? There's less labor applied over the 12 hours. And the fact that, you have 10 workers working for 12 hours is a certain equality of the amount of labor time applied to the products. And therefore, in this case, the 15 products are going to have less value because they have a lot less labor applied, a lot less socially necessary labor, because there's only 2 workers involved now, because you have, let's say, a machine, or you have a really beautifully cooperative 2 laborers. But in this case, as he goes on in this section to show that, like, if the length of the working day and the productivity of labor is constant, this intensity can vary, right? It can go up and down. Some days the workers might produce 10 products, some days they might produce 15. And that means they're producing more value, but it's in terms of number of products. Not, their labor productivity itself has not been improved with less labor. You're talking about the same amount of labor, just producing more products. I mean, I still don't quite get this, but this is how I've tried to explain it to myself. And it makes a little bit more sense. Last time around, I just sort of skipped over this and didn't talk about it. So any questions or?
That was better than an explanation I could come up with.
Yeah, on my 6th time of reading it. Yeah, so. Okay, so then, he goes back and forth to all these different ways. I'm not going to go through all this, but I do think the last page of this chapter is pretty phenomenal, just talking again about social productivity and how productivity itself creates certain social possibilities that under capitalism are sort of squandered, right? Where he says, so the minimum length of the working day is fixed by the necessary component, which is, however, itself capable of further contraction. If the whole, and this is kind of repeating again what he was saying before, if the whole working day were to shrink to the length of the necessary component, surplus labor would vanish, something which is impossible under the regime of capital. Only the abolition of the capitalist form of production would permit the reduction of the working day to the necessary labor time. So then, you know, if we didn't have capitalism, we could just say, let's produce what is necessary, right? And that's what we need to live, and we'll just collectively determine, right? But he says, even in that case, the latter would expand to take up more of the day for two reasons. First, because the workers' condition of life would improve and their aspirations become greater. And second, because a part of what is now surplus labor, which then count as necessary labor, namely labor which is necessary for the formation of social fund for reserve and accumulation. So kind of interesting. He's saying that if workers abolish capitalism, they would actually expand what counts as necessary. They would expand their aspirations, they expand their horizons. And so that's kind of interesting. But also under capitalism, the ways in which productivity is harnessed is really kind of irrational and crazy. So he says, the more the productivity of labor increases, the more working day can be shortened. And the more the working day is shortened, the more the intensity of labor can increase. From the point of view of society, the productivity of labor also grows when economies are made in its use. This implies not only economizing on the means of production, but also avoiding all useless labor. The capitalist mode of production, while it enforces economy, or he's using like efficiency, like economy as efficiency, in each individual business, also begets by its anarchic system of competition the most outrageous squandering of labor power and of the social means of production, not to mention the creation of vast number of functions at present as indispensable, but in themselves superfluous. So if you look around in our world of capitalism and ask yourself how much of production is actually done for useful things that are good for society, and how much is sort of just trying to generate profit for private owners, you can think like, is it really a good use of social resources to spend billions of dollars on the next Avengers film or something? I mean, maybe some Avenger film fans, but like, you know, all the money that gets harnessed into advertising, right? Is that a good, but under capitalism, it makes perfect sense. It's indispensable, but sort of from a social sense, like, is it really good to, we have all this productivity, like capitalism has developed the productive forces to be so productive, so much capacity. And a lot of it's harnessed to do just totally superfluous and wasteful things that aren't useful for society as a whole. So social productivity is great, but if it's harnessed by a certain kind of social relations or a certain kind of social system, it cannot really lead to great outcomes. Then he goes on, the intensity and productivity of labor being given, the part of the social working day necessarily taken up with material production is shorter. As a consequence, the time at society's disposal for the free intellectual and social activity of the individual is greater. So at least with social productivity, you get the possibility that people could be free to just develop, become artists or musicians, or as Ellie was talking about, like we could knit and craft during the day and we'd have time to develop these kind of interests. In proportion as work is more and more evenly divided among the able-bodied members of society, there's some able discussion we've also talked about, and a particular social stratum is more and more deprived of the ability to shift the burden of labor, which is a necessity imposed by nature, from its own shoulders to another social stratum. I think he's talking again, in a free society, we kind of have to figure out how to share that necessary labor, as opposed to just creating a social system where you have as we'll talk about next time, this sort of poor, impoverished surplus population who has to do that necessary labor out of sort of social desperation. We would have to figure out in a free society how to share that necessary labor. Like we're all gonna have to like clean the toilets and do the drudgery and the bad work to make everyone else free, right? But he does say the absolute minimum limit to the shortening of the working day is from the point of view universality of labor. But in capitalist society, free time is produced for one class by the conversion of the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time. So under capitalism, all that capacity and productivity is just basically creates a bunch of luxurious free time for just one class, right? For the capitalist class, who gets all this benefit, while by basically converting the lifetime of the working class into labor time. So again, this contradiction where we have so much technology and productive capacity, we could have this kind of freedom, but under capitalism, all that is squandered, and most of us feel not free, stressed out, overworked. You know, we're spending all our time working for the boss, et cetera, et cetera. And so anyway, this last line, in capitalist society, free time is produced for one class by the conversion of the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time, is a pretty snazzy quote to just use. And one time I put it on Twitter and it like blew up, one of my most popular tweets ever. And it was really funny because then after that, some person replied and said, in case anyone wants this great quote as a beautiful embroidery, I know where you can get it. And he linked to their Etsy page and offered to sell this thing as a commodity. So I thought it was hilarious that this brilliant Marx quote then goes on social media and someone's like, I know how to turn this into money, right? So anyway, I don't know what the full link is, and this tweet is very old, but maybe this embroidery is still available. Okay, so finally, more math, chapter 18. He wants us to look at different formula for the rate of surplus value. Number one should be familiar. It is the sort of equations we've called the rate of surplus value, the rate of exploitation, S over V. And you can look at that in terms of surplus value over variable capital, or the value of labor power, however you want to phrase it, and then look at it in terms of sort of surplus labor over necessary labor. But he says these mutually replaceable formulae are rigorously definite and correct. We therefore find them worked out in classical political economy in substance, but not in conscious form. See, only Marx has the conscious knowledge of what these formulae really mean. Political economy, in fact, provides us with derivative formulae like surplus labor over the working day, surplus value over the value of the product, surplus value product over the total product. And he shows when you look at these formula, you can't see that, like, for instance, again, if you have 6 hours of surplus labor and 6 hours of necessary labor on a 12-hour working day, that's 100% exploitation, or 100% rate of surplus value. But if you look at it 6 hours over 12 hours, you see it as 50%. So it seems less, right? It's basically trying to show that political economists kind of twist these formulae to kind of make it seem like less, that capital is getting less, the workers getting more, and so forth. He also finally gives us a third formula for basically thinking about this in terms of unpaid labor, right, over paid labor. So value of labor power is what the worker gets in payment and wages, but then they produce more over the working day as surplus value. So they get paid that value, but then they produce more value, which is unpaid labor. He says here, I think it's important, after the analysis given above, it is no longer possible to be misled by the formula unpaid labor over paid labor into concluding that capitalist pays for labor and not for labor power. This becomes important in the next section, which is that, again, the value of labor power is the value of a commodity, labor power, which is a bundle of commodities it takes to reproduce the worker outside the hidden abode of production, outside of the workplace, and is not the same as what they give to the capitalist in the in the workplace, in the hidden abode of production. So those are, as he said in chapter 9, I think, 2 in different magnitudes, right? The value of labor power is what it takes to reproduce the worker outside the workplace. What the worker gives to the capitalist is a totally different magnitude. But nevertheless, he says we can sort of think about the value that workers give to the capitalists above the value they get back in wages. We can think about that as a kind of unpaid labor. But again, if you recall, he kind of makes this point that the capitalist has paid the real value for the labor power, right? And the value of the labor power has no relation to what it does in the workplace. It has to do with what it takes to reproduce that labor power, the bundle of commodities that labor power requires to replenish its capacity to work, right? And so he does say later, though, that capital, therefore, is not only the command over labor, as Adam Smith thought, is essentially the command over unpaid labor. All surplus value, whatever particular form, profit, interest, or rent, it may subsequently crystallize into, it is in substance the materialization of unpaid labor time. The secret of the self-valorization of capital resolves itself into the fact that it has at its disposal definite quantity of unpaid labor of other people. Okay. Part 6, he says we're going to look at wages. And here he's really going to flesh out this distinction between what is the value of labor power as a commodity and what's the value of labor that they give, right? Because he says right at the top in chapter 19, on the surface of bourgeois society, the worker's wage appears as the price of labor, as a certain quantity of money that is paid for a certain quantity of labor. Just to kind of, I should have done a sort of more visuals to flesh this out, but if you recall our sort of classic example of a 12-hour working day, where 6 hours the worker reproduces their value of labor power, which is 3 shillings, and then 6 hours they produce the surplus value, which is 3 shillings. It's 6 shillings that they produce in 12 hours. But what Marx is saying here is that if 3 shillings is what the capitalist pays for that 12 hours of labor, that's the price of labor is 3 shillings divided by 12 hours. And he does the math. It's like, you know, again, I'm not good at math. However many shillings per hour is the price of labor, right? And again, it's just taking that value of labor power and saying, what does it cost the capitalist to spread out that value over 12 hours? And that's what he calls the price of labor. But, so he says, thus people speak of the value of labor and call its expression in money its necessary or natural price. On the other hand, they speak of the market prices of labor, prices which oscillate above or below its normal price. But what is the value of a commodity? And that's a rhetorical question. The objective form of the social labor expended in its production. And how do we measure the quantity of this value? By the quantity of labor contained in it. How then is the value of 12 a 12-hour working day to be determined? By 12 hours working contained in the working day of 12 hours, which is an absurd tautology. So again, value of labor power is not what the worker does in production. It's what it takes those commodities to reproduce the worker. But how do we think about the value of what the worker does in production? How do we understand that value? And he says, well, we can understand that it's 12 hours of work. That's what they did. But expressing that as 12 hours of value is just saying the same thing. So what we're going to get into in this section on wages, just as a prequel to what I'm going to say, is that in capitalism, everyone thinks wages are a payment for what you do in production, right? What you contribute to production process. It's a payment for that. And Marx is here to tell you that is a sort of obfuscation of what's really going on. That actually what the value of our labor power under capitalism is has to do with what it takes to reproduce us outside of production, right? So that the ways in which we ideologically sort of attach the wage to this sort of contribution of effort and value in production is a sort of, we're misleading ourselves and the capitalist society. So that did do a little bit of visual. If you go back to our way back to our little concrete world of real life, the abstract world, you recall this labor power commodity has that value of labor power, which is again the bundle of commodities it takes to reproduce the worker. And we say, but it also has a use value, which is that it can perform work for capitalists in the hidden abode of production, right? And that's a different thing, right? That's a different aspect. So what Marx is trying to say here is, does that use value, does that work that they perform have a value? Can we talk about that value? And then he says this, which is one of these lines that confused me and still confuses me, which he says, again, it's not labor which directly confronts the possessor of money on the commodity market, but rather the worker. What the worker is selling is their labor power. As soon as the labor actually begins, it's already ceased to belong to them. It can no longer be sold by them. Labor is the substance and the imminent measure of value, but it has no value itself. So that's one of those brain melting lines. What I think he's saying here is that the only thing that's exchanged in the market is labor power. And we know what that value is. I'm sorry. It's the bundle of commodities it needs to reproduce the worker outside the workplace, right? That's the thing that's exchanged on the market. But the thing that the workers do in production is there's never money exchanged for that, right? That's just the workers performing what they're doing, what the capitalists bought them to do, which is work, right? But that thing itself isn't ever come to market. That thing isn't ever exchanged. So therefore it doesn't have a value, right? It kind of takes us back to chapter 1 where he says value is only value in exchange, right? If it's exchanged on a market. And so it's not unless the capitalist is putting his workers to work and saying, who wants to pay for this work that's happening? Who wants to buy? I'm selling this work that's happening. I mean, that sounds crazy, right? That never happens. They've already paid for something, but that is something different, right? So he says in the expression value of labor, the concept of value is not only completely extinguished, but inverted so that it becomes contrary. It's an expression as imaginary as the value of the earth. So again, he's saying this idea that what workers do in production is value is an imaginary assertion because they already paid for their value. It's something different. These imaginary expressions arise nevertheless from the relations of production themselves. They are categories for the form of appearance of essential relations. That in their appearance, things are often presented in an inverted way is something fairly familiar in every science apart from political economy. So again, Marx, the smart scientist, is trying to tell you that this thing you hear in the world about the value of labor and the wage being a payment for what you do for your employer, it's nice, but it's basically mystifications and it's ideologically confusing what's really going on here. Okay. So, and again, he talks a bit about, and I've talked about this before, how the wage form itself confuses us about where exploitation is, where the surplus is. He says, 6 hours of labor appears as the value or price of the whole working day of 12 hours, which thus includes 6 hours which have not been paid for. The wage form thus extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, into paid labor and unpaid labor. And he's done this before, but he says again, like if you look at slavery and serfdom, it's very clear what's paid and unpaid. In slavery, the whole thing's unpaid. And you might have time where you get to produce your own subsistence separately from the plantation or something like this. But the wage form kind of extinguishes this distinction. So you think the 3 shillings you get are payment for all that 12 hours of work. You as a worker sort of think like, I did this 12 hours and the 3 shillings is a good deal, good payment, right? So you're not even sure. that you're producing a surplus. You're not even aware. So he says even further, we may therefore understand the decisive importance of the transformation of the value and price of labor power into the form of wages, or into the value and the price of labor itself. All the notions of justice held by both the worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production, all capitalism's illusions of freedom, and the apologetic tricks of vulgar economics have their basis in the form of appearance discussed above, which makes the actual relation invisible and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite of that relation. So again, everyone's confused and mystified and ideologically tricked by how capital operates, and scientific Marx uncovers the reality. But this is true. You've heard this phrase, a fair day's wages for a fair day's work, right? We think the wage is this payment for the work we offer to the capitalists. We have movements that say we need something called a living wage, including here at SU, and rightfully so, right? But that kind of discourse talks about how the living wage sends a message to staff that you value the work that you do, because a hard day's work deserves a fair day's pay, right? And you see here, the whole idea of a living wage kind of brings up Marx's point that the wage is actually, or the value of labor power is just to allow you to live outside of the workplace, right? It's about that bundle of commodities, but we think it's about what we do, right? What we contribute to the world, right? And ultimately, as he gets into in volume 3, like ultimately this conflation basically makes it seem like we live in this world where everyone contributes something and gets their fair share of the product, right? The capital contributes their genius and their innovation, they get profit, right? The worker contributes their work and labor and production, they get wages, and the landlord graciously lends their property and gets rent, right? And so all of these actors contribute something, they get something in return. Justice, that's why he says all notions of justice, all notions of freedom are based on this kind of ideological mystifications. I found some, sorry to keep doing funny Twitter things, but I just saw this also in 2020 where they say a TikTok creator calls a dress they spent several days making out of $20 of fabric a $20 dress, which is, in this case, actually erasing the labor they did, right? They're just saying, oh, I was able to turn this $20 into, and I love the Marx red eye thing, which is like, what are you talking about? That's labor. That should add value to the product, right? And then this person added, hi, people have actually read Capital. Yes, I know the products of labor only acquire value through exchange. So this is like a Heinrich type reading about, value only exists in exchange, blah, blah, blah. It's a joke tweet I made at 10 p.m. on a Friday night. Thanks. So anyway, I find this stuff funny. In any event, this is kind of the main point of this whole part 6, is that the wage makes us think it's the value of the labor we give to the capitalist, but it's really the value of labor power. And that, and then he gets into chapters 20 through 22, the different forms of wages. And you'll note that on the top of 20, he says, wages themselves, again, take many forms. This fact is not apparent from the ordinary economic treatises, which in their crude obsession with the material side ignore all differences of form. An exposition of these forms belongs to a special study of wage labor and not therefore to this work. Nevertheless, we shall have to give a brief description of the 2 fundamental forms here. So if you remember from Mendel's introduction, Marx had all these plans. He's going to do 3 volumes of Capital, a 4th volume on the history of theories of surplus value. He's going to do a whole book on the state, a whole book on wage labor, a whole book on market crises and competition, and all that didn't happen, right? But clearly here he's still holding on to this idea. I'm going to write a whole book on wage labor. And it's a shame because a lot of people then just, all we have are these books, right? And these books are called Capital, right? They're really about capital and capitalist and capital accumulation. And so we don't have the book that's really from the perspective of the workers and the working class and wage labor. And that would have been pretty cool to have that book, but we don't have that book. And nevertheless, he says we're going to still talk about wages here briefly, I think, because he wants to really hammer home this point about the value of labor and so forth. So going down, I think it's very interesting that time wages in Marxist time, typically, as we've read, like it typically meant like you're paid by the day, right? The working day. You get a, 3 shillings a day, or the week, right? Paid by the week, right? But we know, what's the time we know of wages? The hour, right? We have hourly. It's kind of interesting on this page. He's sort of, I'm not going to read all this, but on 686, he talks about how when capitalists have tried to create hourly wages or wages by the hour, it actually gives them an advantage. He says the capitalists can now wring from the worker a certain quantity of surplus labor without allowing them the labor time necessary for their own subsistence. He can annihilate all regularity of employment and according to his own convenience, caprice, and the interest of the moment, make the most frightful overwork alternate with relative absolute cessation of work. Think about now, a big issue with workers is not knowing their schedules, not being able to get enough working hours for subsistence. And this is just sort of normal in our day, right? He can abnormally lengthen the working day without giving the worker any corresponding compensation under the pretense of paying the normal price of labor. Hence the perfectly rational revolt of the London building workers in 1860 against the attempt of the capitalists to impose of them this sort of wage by the hour. So again, in Marx's day, hourly wages were seen as this sort of horribly exploitative kind of exception to the rule, and workers went on strike because of the very notion of hourly wages. And now most workers work, it's just sort of accepted. This is how we do time wages. It's hourly wages, right? So things have maybe gotten worse since Marx wrote this. There's some, in this, he doesn't just say we're confused about where the surplus is, society's confused, but he also is very insistent that the capitalist is confused. Capitalist is confused. And he says, and this is in time wages, it's also interesting because it shows how it is only the semblance of the relations of production which is reflected by the brain of the capitalist. He does not know that the normal price of labor also includes a definite quantity of unpaid labor. Even the capitalist isn't really aware of this surplus labor. And that the very unpaid labor is the normal source of their profits. The category of surplus labor time does not exist at all for them, since it includes the normal working day, which they think is paid for by the day's wages. So they also think they're paying for the labor in full. And then earlier in that chapter, he has this great line where he says, let us consider, on the other hand, the capitalists. They wish to receive as much labor as possible for as little money as possible. In practice, therefore, the only thing that interests them is the difference between the price of labor power and the value which its function creates. But they try to buy all commodities as cheaply as possible. And their own invariable explanation of their profit is that is the result of mere sheer sharp practice of buying under the value and selling over it. Hence, they never come to see that if such a thing as the value of labor really existed and they really paid the value, no capital would exist and that never would be transformed into capital. But this line here that they attribute their profits to their sharp practice. I mean, capitalists think they make surplus value because they're smart and they're geniuses and they're innovative, and it's all that they've gotten these things cheaply and they're selling them for more. So again, the capitalists have no idea that it's really coming from the workers. Finally, well, not finally, he gets into piece wages, which are paid, you don't get paid by the amount of time you work, you get paid by how much product you know, this is classic in like migrant farm working, you know, how many baskets of blueberries you can pick, you get paid by the piece, or in textiles, how many shirts you can sew per, you get paid by the shirt, whatever it is, right? And he shows that, okay, if we have our 12 hours, 6 paid, 6 unpaid, the value product, 6 shillings, the value product of 1 hour labor will be 6D. I still don't know what D is. Let us suppose that result of the experience, a worker working with the average amount of intensity and skill devoting to the production of an article only the amount of labor time socially necessary, produces in the course of 12 hours 24 pieces, either distinct products or measurable parts of the same integral construction. The value of these 24 pieces after we have subtracted the amount of constant capital contained in them will be 6 shillings. The value of a single piece 3D, the worker receives 1.5 D per piece and earns 3 shillings in 12 hours. Probably didn't need to read all that, but all that's to show that you can rig the piece rate to create a value that is, again, not representative of the amount of value that the workers actually produce in that 12 hours, right? So it's just another way to show that the wage form, whatever form it's going to have, does not need to represent the amount of work or value that the workers actually do. But the piece rate, the piece wage system comes with a lot of advantages for capitalists. He says, you know, in the large workshops of the London tailors, a certain piece of work, a waistcoat, is called an hour or a half an hour being valued at 6D. Practice determines the size of the average product of 1 hour. With new fashions, repairs, I guess that doesn't continue there. But he says, since the quality and intensity of the work are here controlled by the very form of the wage, superintendence of labor becomes to a great extent superfluous. So because the workers know that they only get paid by how much work they do, this is kind of, if any of you ever read like Foucault about like disciplining yourself and self-discipline, he's trying to say that like the workers under piece rate system will discipline themselves because they know their payment is about how hard they work. So then you can, as a capitalist, you can save money on management and kind of trying to push the workers to work harder because they know, unlike an hourly wage, like it's not like you get paid regardless of what you do. The more work you do, the more you get paid. So you don't need to even invest in management or superintendents or all this stuff. He goes on further to say, the proportion between wages and surplus value remains unaltered since the massive surplus labor supplied by each particular worker corresponds with the wage they receive. But the wider scope that the piece wages give to individuality tends to develop both that individuality and with it the worker's sense of liberty, of independence, of self-control, and also of the competition of workers with each other. The piece wage, therefore, has tended. What is going on? Later on, he says the piece wage is a form of wage most appropriate to the capitalist mode of production. So workers even feel like, you know, again, the more work I do, the more wage I get. So the labor I'm giving to the capitalist is equal to the wage I get, right? So this is what part 6 is about, is that all these ideological mystifications that tell the workers and the capitalists that the work they're doing is equivalent to the wage. And if in piece wages, it kind of convinces workers that if they work harder, they get more for themselves. So they become more like free individuals. Like the harder I work, the better I do, right? And they can compete with other workers. Say, look, I picked 10 bushels of blueberries in an hour. What did you do, right? I got all this money. What did you do, right? And this kind of creates all this sort of classic stuff of ideological individualization, competition, self-control. So it's interesting though, because piece wages are not that common today. And so if it's the most appropriate form of the capitalist mode of production, the question becomes how come we don't have it anymore? But we can talk about that later in discussion. And the kind of interesting thing is that when you have a piece wage system, the workers themselves can sort of start to figure out, wait a second, if you're paying me this much per product, and then you're selling it for this much, I can see what your profit is. I can see you're getting way more than I'm getting, right? And he says the operatives carefully watch the price of the raw material, the price of the manufactured goods, and are thus enabled to form an accurate estimate of the master's profits. But the capitalist rightly rejects such pretensions as being gross errors as the nature of wage labor. He cries out against this presumptuous attempt to lay taxes on the progress of industry and declares roundly that the productivity of labor does not concern the worker in the least. So again, The capitalists are like, no, stupid worker. It's all about my genius, innovation, the machinery I've given you, all this stuff. I need to take what is due to me. Don't worry about, yourself. Okay, finally, as a geographer, it's very depressing that he has a section called National Differences in Wages, which is like a real live, really fascinating issue about like how do wages differ across nations, across geographical regions. And it's about, I don't know, 4 pages long, and it's like very truncated, very there's just a lot more that could be said about this stuff. But he talks about, and I think those about, like those of us that have traveled around the world can, know like in a given country only, there's different intensities of labor, right? People have different cultures of work about like, breaks and taking time off and this kind of stuff. The average intensity of labor changes from country to country. Here, the national averages form a scale whose unit of measurement is the average unit of universal labor. The more intense national labor, therefore, as compared with the less intense, produces in the same time more value, which expresses itself in more money. The law of value is yet more modified in its international application by the fact on the world market, national labor, which is more productive, also counts as more intensive, as long as the more productive nation is not compelled by competition to lower the selling price of its commodities to the level of their value. And then he gets on to a very interesting discussion that even if parts of the world where wages are really low, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not more expensive to the capitalist. He says, J.W. Cowell, Factory Commission of 1833, came to the conclusion after a careful investigation of the spinning trade that in England wages are virtually lower to the capitalist than in the continent of Europe. The English factory inspector Alexander Redgrave in the report of 1866 proves by comparing the statistics of continental states that in spite of lower wages and much longer hours of work, continental labor is in proportion to the product more dearer, more expensive than English. So I think here he's trying to get us to say that it's not just the wages that matter, it's the level of intensity and the level of productivity that surrounds those workers that really determine how expensive their labor is to the capitalists. He goes on to say that in Russia, with much less developed productivity in the industry, wages are cheap, but the workers aren't producing much value. They're not very productive because of these things. But he closes the chapter by trying to say that let's not get crazy here. And again, I won't read all this, but he really wants to skewer this guy named H. Carey, who in the essay on the rate of wages, one of his first economic writings, tries to prove that the differences in national wage levels are directly proportional to the degree of productivity of the working day of each nation. In order to draw from this international ratio the deduction that wages everywhere rise and fall in proportion to the productivity of labor. The whole of our analysis of the proportion of surplus value shows that this deduction would be absurd, even if Carey himself had demonstrated his premises instead of shuffling a confused mass of statistical material to and fro in his usual uncritical and superficial manner. So he's really, hating on Carey here. But ultimately, and he goes on and on, he's trying to again say, we can't say the wage level is directly proportional to how productive the workers are, because that would, again, make us assume that the wage is the payment for how productive workers are directly and proportionally, and that under capitalism, that I think ultimately that wage level is a product more of struggle between the capitalist and worker. And you can have really productive workers that are paid really low because of the state of class struggle, because of the state of organization of the working class and things like this. So we don't want to go too far with this notion that wage levels are directly proportional to the productivity of labor, because again, that makes us think that wages are directly related to what laborers do in production, which is again the main point of all this. Okay. Any questions about parts 5 and 6? Next time we get into the accumulation of capital, which just brings up a whole nother set of can of worms, if you will. And it leads to kind of some of the most quotable and exciting passages and stuff. But it's definitely like a big shift. So get ready for that. Do we want to take a break? So see you back at like 3:42.